what's the deal with these Viking people? What are these guys doing? Why in the 8th century does it appear that somebody went, I'm tired of sitting on the couch. Let's go out and steal some things and kill some people. Why does that happen?
Well, let's dispel the first, what I like to call, myth about the beginning of the Viking Age. And that is that they appeared suddenly and out of nowhere.
Exactly.
They just, if you ask historians from the 20th century, or if we had the ability to, most of them are dead, but these secondary sources we talk about, they presume that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is correct, that they just appeared out of nowhere, and that is actually not the case. Even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has an entry 4 years before Lindisfarne, which is the so-called beginning of the Viking Age in England, talking about an incident at the port of Portland where the so-called Vikings killed the king's reeve because they tried to levy taxes on them. Right. Evidently, the Vikings were not keen on paying taxes.
Yeah, right. No, that is actually true. We have other accounts where they take false oaths, which is a bad thing to do, and pretend to be this or that, monotheists, so that they don't have to pay the tax in various trade relationships. Yeah.
And there's a phenomenal study that came out, I want to say 3-4 years ago. I could be off on that, but it found through studying whetstones, the production of whetstones, that trade between Norway, so this quarry that made the whetstones, where the whetstone rock came from, up in Norway, reached what is now Normandy in the early 8th century, so several decades before. So there were trade networks between those areas long before the beginning of the so-called Viking Age. So did they appear suddenly? No, there was an awareness of who they were. I think some of Charlemagne's chroniclers talk about this. We don't know if Charlemagne really, did the things that his chroniclers say. Like, there's a scene where he goes down to Aquitaine, and then the Vikings try to attack the town that he's in. He happens to be there. They figure this out, so they turn tail and run. Viking ships were so quick, they got out of there. The Carolingians couldn't catch up. But then there's a scene that the chronicler Rambert describes of Charlemagne looking out the window and having a tear of sorrow, saying, he's lamenting, saying, I'm terrified of what these pagan people will do when I die and what will become of my empire, right? We don't know if that actually happened, but it's a great little story to say that, the Carolingians were aware of who they were. And it makes sense, because after they conquered Saxony, they shared a border with the Danes, who were raiding in Frisia, and they were raiding a little bit east with the Aberdice. So they didn't just burst out of nowhere, but the nature of the raids, the frequency of the raids, did change at a certain point, kind of late 8th century, and that's what we're really talking about. So why did it increase, and what spurred on the changing nature of the Viking Age and Viking activities in the rest of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I think the suddenness is just for the Western people, right? I.e. in England, like you called out the Lindisfarne mentioned in the Chronicle.
Yes, the Anglocentrism.
Yes, exactly. The English were like, well, we're the center of the world, and we've never heard of these people before. So hence, when they show up on our shores, it's the first time. They were very active in what we say the East, but basically say around the Baltic, in what are now places like Latvia, Estonia, Poland, even into Ukraine, of course, and we'll talk about that coming up with a guest as well. But so that's predating all of this stuff that we're talking about in the 8th century. And so I think you're right. I mean, I actually wrote a piece that we'll link up in the description that was just this past August in 2022, where I literally say this was no turning point in history. Basically, what we have is an expansion of something that was already going on. And it's just at that point finally reaching the Western parts of Europe. And so those people are in shock and awe mode, but it's not. The shock and awe is probably at the violence and the terror, because they knew those people from before a little bit from trade, but then it's like, hey, you used to trade with me. Now you're just like stealing my stuff. What's going on here?
Yeah. And what happened? Well,
Yeah.
It is. I like what you say. It's like it's an expansion of a trend that was already happening. It's a trend that has been given the name, and I don't know if this still stands in academia anymore, but it's called the Great Migration Period.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's after the fall of the Roman Empire, and you had the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, which evidently have one mention in Bede's. So the chronicler Bede, Bede. I don't know if I'm
Yeah, the
pronouncing.
venerable
Yeah.
Bede. Yes.
Right. So yeah, Bede. There we go. I call him Bede. I don't know, whatever. In French, it's bed. But he mentions the Jutes once, and then we never hear about them again. So we don't even know if they were real. But we'll just stick with the Angles and the Saxons, and they came over to England, and then you had the Franks that moved into Gaul, and then from there that opened up space for actually Scandinavians to move south a little bit too. So we had a lot of population movements, and the region of Brittany in France is a really good test case to show that the Viking Age was just a repeat of something that happened even before, because before the Romans completely withdrew from Gaul, the coast of what was then called Armoricus is the Breton Peninsula. If we had a map, I could kind of point at it. But so basically how I describe Brittany is it's the arm that reaches into the Atlantic Ocean, right? Yeah. And the Romans called it Armorica, and they built what was called the first Atlantic Wall. So if you recall World War II, the Germans built an Atlantic Wall to repel the Allies. Well, the Romans were the first to create defenses around, and that's why they called it Armorica, essentially the armored coast, was to repel raiders. And who were the raiders? They were a Germanic tribe, none other than the Franks, who had a very strong seafaring tradition that they then abandoned for mainland invasions. But then the Vikings later, through 2-3 centuries later, pick up the gauntlet and essentially resume that same activity. So if we go back and we ask ourselves, well, why did the Franks start leaving home in their ships to raid the coast as far away as Brittany if they were leaving from the Baltic? We might be able to find parallels with this, some similar conditions that may have caused the Vikings to leave in that same manner.